6 hours before the most important negotiation of her life, Mara Okonkwo-Voss was refilling the ambassador's water glass. That was her job: logistics, translation support, the person who made sure the right briefing packet was on the right chair at the right time. She had a diplomatic credential, technically the same as everyone else on the delegation, but nobody on the station called her a diplomat. They called her Ray's assistant, when they bothered to use a name at all. She didn't mind, mostly. She told herself she didn't mind. Ambassador Daniel Reyes was standing at the viewport of their assigned quarters aboard Concord Station, watching the two moons drift slowly toward each other in the black. He'd been humanity's senior representative in this system for 6 years. He knew the Vantral and the Dorun better than any human alive. He'd built relationships, learned the etiquette, memorized the history of a conflict that had smoldered for 3 centuries without ever quite catching fire. He turned from the window, opened his mouth to say something, and collapsed. Mara was across the room before she registered moving. By the time station medical arrived, Reyes was breathing but unresponsive, his skin an alarming shade of gray. The Dorun physician who examined him used words like cross-species toxin reaction and atmospheric contamination, and not immediately fatal, but he will not be conscious for days. Mara stood in the corridor outside medical, still holding the water glass she'd been filling 20 minutes earlier, and listened to her own pulse in her ears. Days, she repeated. The station's human liaison, a nervous man named Petrosian, was already pulling up a communication window. I'm requesting an emergency replacement from Earth. Full priority. They can have someone here in. How long? He checked, his face fell. 11 days minimum. The convergence is in 3. He didn't answer because there was nothing to say. Everyone on the station knew what the convergence was. In 3 days, the twin moons of Eilish and Koth would align with their shared sun in a configuration that occurred once every 140 years. At the exact moment of alignment, an ancient structure suspended in the gravitational balance point between the two moons, a thing both species called in their own languages, something that translated roughly to the spire, would activate. Nobody currently alive had seen it happen. Nobody knew exactly what it would do. But both species agreed on one thing: whoever controlled the spire when it activated would hold an advantage that could last for another century and a half. Both fleets were already moving into position, not attacking, not yet. Just close enough that a single mistake, a single misread signal, could turn a standoff into a war neither side could walk back from. That was why Reyes had been sent. That was why the summit had been called. 3 days to get 2 species, who hated each other's ancestors, to agree on who got to stand near a glowing rock when the lights came on. And now the only human on this station, qualified to lead that summit, was unconscious in a medical bay, and the summit started in 6 hours. Get me command, Mara said. Petrosian blinked. For what? I'm going to need to know exactly what's already been agreed, what hasn't, and who's walking through that door in 6 hours expecting to meet an ambassador. Mara, you're not. He stopped himself, but not soon enough. I know what I'm not, she said quietly. I also know there isn't anyone else. The Vantral delegation arrived first. Speaker Nithora moved through the station's corridors inside a mobile pressure suit that kept her skin moist and her body cooled, the way all Vantral did when traveling outside their ocean world of Eilish. She was tall for her species, her long limbs folded with careful economy, her skin, visible through the suit's transparent paneling, a deep blue-violet that shifted in slow, rolling patterns whenever she felt strong emotion. Mara had read the briefing. Vantral's skin patterns were involuntary. They couldn't lie with their bodies, even if they lied with their words. Nithora stopped in the doorway of the conference chamber and looked at Mara for a long moment. Her skin flickered, a fast ripple of pale gold, gone almost before Mara caught it. Surprise! Where is Ambassador Reyes? Nithora asked, through the small translation unit at her throat. Medically incapacitated, Mara said. I'm his second, Mara Okonkwo-Voss. You are the aides. I was the aide, today I'm the delegate. Nithora's skin rippled again, longer this time, a slow wave of deep red that Mara couldn't yet translate but didn't like the look of. Then the speaker said nothing else and took her seat. The Dorun arrived 20 minutes later, and they did not arrive quietly. Warden Giatram Delu was built like something meant to survive being dropped from orbit, a full head taller than any human in the room, his skin a mottled gray-brown that looked, and Mara suspected functionally was closer to stone than flesh. The Dorun lived beneath the crust of Koth, in tunnel cities lit by bioluminescent fungus and cooled by geothermal vents, and they had evolved to communicate as much through vibration as through sound. Mara felt G.A.Trom's arrival in the floor before she heard his voice. He looked at the empty chair where Reyes should have been sitting, then he looked at Mara. "This is an insult," he said, his translator rendering his voice as a low, gravel-flat monotone that did nothing to soften the words. "We were promised the senior human ambassador. Instead, we are given a junior aide." "Ambassador Reyes collapsed 6 hours ago," Mara said. "I'm not here because anyone thinks I'm equal to him. I'm here because the alternative was an empty chair, and I didn't think either of you wanted that." G.A.Trom's vibration deepened. A low rumble Mara felt more than heard, rolling up through the floor and into the soles of her boots. She didn't know yet if that meant anger or simple displeasure. She made a note to find out. "Then let us begin," Nithora said, "and discover quickly whether this was a mistake." It was a mistake for the first 90 minutes. Reyes had prepared a formal framework, opening statements, position papers, a structured agenda moving from lesser disputes toward the central question of the spire. Mara followed it because it was the only plan she had, and because deviating from a plan she didn't fully understand felt more dangerous than following one she did. It fell apart exactly the way structured things fall apart when the people inside them have spent 300 years not trusting each other. Nithora's opening statement referenced an incident 200 years earlier when Dorun forces had allegedly poisoned a Vantral coastal breeding ground. G.A.Trom's response referenced an incident predating that one, when Vantral raiders had allegedly collapsed a Dorun tunnel system, killing 40 families. Both delegations had entire historical arguments prepared, complete with archival citations, and both delegations delivered them like weapons. By the second hour, G.A.Trom had stood up twice. By the third, Nithora's skin had gone a steady, furious crimson that hadn't faded once in 20 minutes, and she'd stopped using the word warden and started using something her translator rendered only as untranslatable profanity formal register. "This is exactly what happened 40 years ago," Petrosian murmured to Mara from the observation seat behind her, his voice tight with panic. "The last attempt at a treaty. It collapsed in the first day. They went home and spent the next 4 decades arming for a war that never quite started." "I know," Mara said. "I read the file." "Then you know we don't have 40 years. We have 60 hours. Mara watched G.A.Trom delude across the table, his massive hands flat against the surface, his whole frame rigid with a fury that made the table itself hum faintly beneath her fingertips. She watched Nithora beside him, skin blazing red, her long fingers curled tight enough that the suit's fabric had started to pucker at the knuckles. And she thought, they're not actually arguing about 200 years ago. They're arguing about something else, and the history is just the language they have for it. She had seen this before. Not on a space station, not between alien species with foreign biology and ancient grudges, but in a resettlement office in Nairobi, 9 years earlier, sitting across a table from 2 families who had fled the same conflict on opposite sides of it, screaming about a grazing dispute from a decade earlier that was never really about the goats. It had never been about the goats. It had been about who got to grieve out loud and who got told to be quiet about it. "I'd like to suspend the formal session," Mara said. Both delegates turned to look at her, as if they'd forgotten she was in the room. "We have not concluded the historical review," Nithora said. "We're not going to conclude it," Mara said. "Not like this. I've read the transcripts from the last treaty attempt. This is exactly how that one died 40 years ago in this same room, probably at this same point in the agenda. I don't think either of you actually wants to spend the next 40 years doing this again, so I'm asking for a recess, not to stop talking, to start talking differently." "Differently how?" G.A.Trom's voice was flat, suspicious. Mara took a breath. "I want to have dinner with you, both of you, not as delegates, just as people for one evening, before we go back to being the 2 of you and the empty chair where Reyes should be sitting." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Petrosian actually put his head in his hands. Then Nithora's skin shifted, not red now, but a slow, uncertain blue-gray Mara hadn't seen yet. "That is not protocol." "No," Mara agreed. "It isn't." They ate in a smaller room, at a round table instead of a long one, with no observers and no translators standing behind chairs like sentries. Mara had asked the station kitchen to prepare something from each of their homeworlds, a request that had taken 2 hours and nearly broken the galley staff, but had produced, eventually, a strange and careful spread. Cold mineral-rich kelp dishes for Nithora, dense fermented fungus loaves for Ga, and for herself, plain bread and lentils, because she hadn't wanted to make either of them eat alone while she ate something foreign to both of them. For the first 20 minutes, nobody spoke about the spire at all. Mara asked Nithora about her family, and learned that Vantral speakers were chosen not by election, but by a kind of hereditary current reading, an ability to sense subtle shifts in ocean pressure that Vantral considered a form of listening to their ancestors. Nithora's mother had been a speaker before her grandmother before that. "And you," Nithora asked, her skin rippling a soft, curious green, "how does your species choose who speaks for it?" "Badly mostly," Mara said, and something in Gatrom's chest rumbled, a low, surprised sound that might have been a laugh. She asked Gatrom about the tunnel cities of Koth, and he described them with more warmth than she'd heard from him all day, the bioluminescent fungus gardens that lit entire districts in soft green gold, the way sound carried for kilometers through the stone so that an entire city could hear a newborn's first cry. "It sounds beautiful," Mara said, and meant it. "It is dying," Gatrom said, and the warmth vanished from his voice as quickly as it had come. "Slowly. Our world's geothermal core is cooling faster than our scientists predicted a century ago. In 3 generations, perhaps 4, the tunnels will be too cold to sustain the fungus gardens, too cold to sustain us." Mara set down her fork. "I didn't know that." "Few humans do." "It isn't in your briefing files, I imagine, because it is not relevant to the treaty as your ambassador understood it." He looked at her directly for the first time all evening. "But it is relevant to the spire. The Vantral believe the spire marks the place their ancestors were chosen by the ocean itself. We believe it marks the place our ancestors were given fire beneath the stone. Both of us believe that whoever controls it when it wakes will be granted something, protection, prosperity, the favor of whatever built it. My people are dying slowly in the dark, Ambassador. We do not fight for the spire because we hate the Vantral. We fight for it because we are afraid, and it is the only hope anyone has offered us in 300 years. Across the table, Nithora's skin had gone very still, a pale, watchful silver Mara hadn't seen before. "We are not afraid of dying in the dark," Nithora said quietly. "We are afraid of drowning in silence. 200 years ago, the Dorun action against our breeding grounds did not simply kill fish and kelp. It silenced an entire current-reading lineage, an unbroken line of speakers going back 11 generations. My family only exists because my great-great-grandmother happened to be traveling inland that season. We do not fight for the spire because we hate the Dorun. We fight for it because we are afraid of being erased, and it is the only promise anyone has ever made us that we might not be." The room was quiet for a long moment. Mara realized, distantly, that this was the first time in 300 years, according to every record she'd read, that a Vantral speaker and a Dorun warden had sat in the same room and told each other, plainly, what they were actually afraid of. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." "Why does it matter what we are afraid of?" Gatrom asked, not unkindly, just genuinely uncertain. "Fear does not change what the spire is or who has the right to it." "Maybe not," Mara said, "but it changes what kind of agreement is worth making. Nobody in that formal session today was negotiating over a rock in space. You were negotiating over who gets to survive. That's not a problem you solve by dividing territory. That's a problem you solve by making sure both of you actually do survive." Neither of them answered, but neither of them argued either, and for the first time all day, Mara let herself believe that mattered. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she went looking for someone who might know more about the spire than the standard historical file, and found him in the station's small archival annex at 2 in the morning, surrounded by data crystals stacked in uneven towers. Yuval was old, even by Dorun standards, his stone-gray skin pale and cracked with age, his movements slow and deliberate. He was the station's resident historian, a Dorun scholar who had spent 40 years cataloging both species' origin records, and he looked entirely unsurprised to find a human standing in his doorway in the middle of the night. "You are the understudy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Everyone on this station is talking about your dinner. The warden hasn't shared a meal with a Vantral official in 11 years. He gestured at the crystal towers around him. "What do you want, Ambassador?" "I want to know why the spire matters, not the treaty language, the actual myth, both versions." Yuval studied her for a long moment, then pulled 2 crystals from separate towers and set them side by side on his desk, activating a small holographic reader between them. The Vantral origin story, projected in shifting blue light, described a great current that had once swept through the ocean of Eilish, carrying a fragment of something that fell from the sky, a shard of light that sank to the seafloor and called out, in a language the first Vantral learned to hear, teaching them to read the pressure of the deep and understand one another without sound. That was the spire's origin point, according to Vantral tradition, the place their ancestors were chosen. The Dorun origin story, projected beside it in warm amber light, described a fissure that had opened in the crust of Koth in ancient times, releasing heat and light where there had only been cold stone before, and a fragment that fell from the fissure that taught the first Dorun to feel meaning in vibration, to hear one another through the rock itself. That was the spire's origin point, according to Dorun tradition, the place their ancestors were given fire. Mara stared at the 2 stories, side by side, for a long time. "They're the same event," she said slowly. Yuval's cracked face shifted into something that might have been the Dorun equivalent of a smile. "I have believed that for 30 years. I have never been permitted to say so publicly. Both species have built centuries of religious and political identity on the assumption that the spire chose them, specifically, uniquely. The idea that it might have fallen once and touched both worlds at the same moment, that it might have been a single event witnessed differently by 2 different species on 2 different moons, is not popular with either government." "Do you have proof?" "I have inference. Geological dating on both worlds places the events within the same century, an unusually tight window, for 2 supposedly unrelated occurrences. I have linguistic drift analysis showing that the earliest Vantral and Dorun words for chosen and given share a root neither species scholars can otherwise explain. I have 3 centuries of both species independently describing the same object, falling light, buried in stone, waking in cycles, without either side ever comparing notes, because comparing notes has never once been attempted." He looked at her. "I have inference, ambassador. I do not have proof, and I am one old archivist that both governments have politely ignored for 3 decades. "What if the spire didn't choose either of you specifically?" Mara said slowly, thinking out loud. "What if it fell once, touched both worlds in the same event, and taught 2 very different species to listen, one through water, one through stone, because it wanted both of you to survive together, not separately?" Yuval was quiet for a long moment. "That," he said, "would mean the entire war has been fought over a misunderstanding of your own scripture." "Yes," Mara said, "it would." "And in 2 days," Yuval said, "it will wake again, and both fleets are currently positioned to make certain the other side is nowhere near it when it does." Mara looked at the 2 projected origin stories, still glowing side by side in the darkroom, blue light and amber light overlapping faintly where they met in the middle. "Then I need to get both delegations to the spire together," she said, "before it wakes, not after a treaty, not with a signed document deciding who owns what. I need them standing there together when it happens, the way it happened the first time, if you're right." Yuval's expression didn't change, but something in his vibration, she felt it through the floor, faint but unmistakable, shifted into something like hope. "That," he said, "has never been attempted either." Getting the delegations to agree took the entire next day, and it very nearly didn't happen. Giatram Delu called it reckless, then insulting, then, after Mara laid Yuval's evidence in front of him, origin story beside origin story, blue light and amber light, he called it something quieter, something his translator rendered simply as troubling. Nithora's reaction was worse before it was better. Her skin cycled through a storm of colors Mara had no framework to read, landing finally on a deep, unmoving black that Yuval, standing beside her, identified quietly as grief. "You are telling me," Nithora said, "that my grandmother's grandmother did not die defending a sacred and singular truth. You are telling me she died defending a misunderstanding." "I'm telling you," Mara said carefully, "that she died defending something she believed with her whole heart, in a world where nobody had ever offered her the alternative. That's not the same as dying for nothing, but it might mean nobody else has to." Nithora didn't answer, but she didn't leave the room either. The fleets were the harder problem. Both governments back home, receiving updates through increasingly frantic diplomatic channels, wanted their forces to hold defensive position near the spire through the convergence, not because either government trusted Mara's theory, but because neither trusted the other enough to stand down first. Mara spent 6 hours on a secure channel with Earth Command, explaining a plan that sounded, even to her, uncomfortably close to insane. both delegations unescorted, standing together at the spire's location during an event nobody understood, based on the inference of one archivist and the instincts of a junior diplomatic aide who'd been in the job for 11 months. "If you're wrong," her supervisor said, voice flat with disbelief, "you will be standing in the middle of the first shot fired in a war that's been building for 3 centuries. "If I'm right," Mara said, "I'll be standing in the middle of the moment it never has to happen." There was a long silence on the channel. "Reyes is still unconscious," her supervisor said finally. "This is your call, Akonquovas, understand that." "I understand that," Mara said. The convergence arrived the way all cosmic events arrive slowly, then all at once. Mara stood on a small transport shuttle, positioned at the gravitational midpoint between Eilish and Koth, the spire visible through the forward viewport, a structure that had defied every attempt at analysis for 3 centuries, dark stone shot through with veins of something that shimmered faintly even in the absence of any obvious light source, suspended in perfect stillness against the black. Nithora stood on one side of the small observation deck, her pressure suit humming faintly. Giatram Delu stood on the other, close enough to the deck plating that Mara could feel his low, tense vibration through her boots. Neither of them had spoken to the other in almost an hour. Behind them, on tactical displays relayed from both fleets, Mara could see the ships, dozens of them, Vantral and Dorun in equal number, holding position at a distance. Neither commander had been willing to close, weapons armed, waiting for a single wrong signal. "If this fails," Giatram said quietly, not looking at her, "there will be no recess. There will be no second dinner. There will only be the war we have been circling for 300 years. "I know," Mara said. "Then why did you bring us here?" Mara looked out at the spire, its faint shimmer growing subtly brighter as the 2 moons and their star drew into alignment outside the viewport. "Because for 300 years," she said, "nobody ever tried standing together. Everyone tried standing apart and arguing about who had the right to stand closer. I don't know what's about to happen. I'm not an archivist and I'm not a historian, and 6 days ago I was pouring water for a man who actually knew what he was doing. But I know that every time your 2 species have faced this moment separately, it's ended the same way, and I don't think you can find out anything different by doing the same thing a 4th time." Nithora's skin, visible through her suit, had settled into a color Mara hadn't seen before, not the red of anger, not the black of grief, but a slow, luminous silver blue that seemed to pulse gently, almost in time with her breathing. "My mother told me a speaker's duty is to listen to what others cannot hear," she said quietly. "I have spent this entire negotiation certain that meant listening to the ocean. I am beginning to think it meant something else." The spire brightened. It happened gradually at first, the shimmering veins in the stone deepening from a faint glow to something closer to true light, gold and blue-white intertwining in slow spirals across the structure's surface. Then, as the alignment reached its exact center, the light didn't flare or explode, or do any of the violent things 3 centuries of anxious speculation had imagined. It simply spread outward, gently, in a wave that passed through the small shuttle without resistance, without heat, without sound. And for one impossible moment, Mara felt something she had no words for, not quite a voice, not quite a memory, but something like the sensation of an old current moving through still water, and something like the sensation of warmth rising through cold stone, arriving at the exact same instant, from the exact same place, the way they must have arrived the very first time, 300 years before any war had given either species a reason to believe they'd arrived separately. Beside her, Nithora's skin blazed with light Mara had never seen before, not fear, not fury, something closer to recognition. Giatram Delu had gone utterly still, his low vibration deepening into something that resonated through the entire deck, a sound Mara felt in her chest more than heard. Then it was over. The light settled back into its familiar faint shimmer. The spire hung in the dark exactly as it had for 300 years, apparently unchanged. Nobody spoke for a long time. "I felt it," Nithora said finally, very quietly. "The way my mother described feeling the deep current when she was chosen as speaker. I felt it, and I felt something else beneath it, something that did not feel like it belonged only to my people." "I felt fire," Giatram said, his voice rough, "and beneath the fire something that felt like water. I have never felt water in my life, Ambassador. I do not know how I know what it was." Mara looked between them and found she couldn't speak at all for a moment. "It touched both of you," she said finally, "at the same time. In the same way, it must have touched your ancestors, before either of you had a reason to believe it belonged to only one of you. Nithora turned to look at Giatram Delu. Really look at him, Mara realized, for what might have been the first time in either of their lives. 300 years, she said softly. 300 years, Giatram agreed, arguing over which of us the fire chose, when perhaps it was never a choosing at all. Perhaps it was only ever an invitation to listen to one another, and we have spent 3 centuries too afraid to accept it. Behind them on the tactical displays, both fleets held their positions, weapons still armed, waiting for orders that had not come, and in that moment seemed suddenly very far away. The treaty they signed 4 days later bore almost no resemblance to anything Reyes had drafted before his collapse. There was no division of territory around the spire, because Mara had argued, and both delegations had eventually agreed, that dividing it would only recreate the argument in miniature. Instead, the agreement established joint stewardship, a rotating council of Vantral and Dorun scholars, drawn equally from both worlds, charged with studying the spire together rather than separately for the first time in recorded history. Alongside it, in language that had taken almost as long to negotiate as everything else combined, both governments committed to sharing technology, Vantral water reclamation systems that might slow the cooling of Koth's geothermal core, and Dorun deep crust engineering that might help stabilize the coastal breeding grounds the Vantral had spent 2 centuries mourning. It wasn't peace. Mara was careful never to call it that, in any of the briefings she gave afterward. 300 years of grief and fear didn't dissolve because 2 delegations stood together under a light neither of them fully understood. But it was, for the first time in living memory on either world, a beginning that hadn't been built entirely on who was afraid of losing more. Ambassador Reyes woke on the 5th day, weak but alert, and was informed by a visibly exhausted Petrosian that the treaty had already been signed. "Without me," Reyes said, not quite a question. "Your understudy handled it," Petrosian said. Reyes was quiet for a long moment, then he asked to see her. Mara found him sitting up in the medical bay, looking pale but sharp-eyed, a data pad with the signed treaty terms balanced on his lap. "You threw out my entire framework," he said, without preamble. "I did." "You had dinner with them, off the record, off protocol, no observers." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you understand how many rules that broke?" "I understand I didn't have a better option," Mara said. "You weren't there, someone had to be. I wasn't qualified to run a formal negotiation, so I stopped trying to run one." Reyes studied the treaty terms again, the Joint Stewardship Council, the shared technology provisions, a resolution structure built on something closer to reconciliation than territorial compromise. "I've been the senior human diplomat in this system for 6 years, he said finally. "I read every file on this dispute. I memorized the history, the grievances, the treaty language from 40 years ago. I never once asked either delegate what they were afraid of." "You didn't have time to," Mara said. "You were managing a crisis." "I only had time to listen, because I didn't know how to do anything else." Reyes shook his head slowly, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled, small, tired, genuine. "That's not a lesser skill, Akonquovas," he said. "That's the one most of us forget how to use, the longer we do this job. I think it might be the only reason those 2 moons aren't currently at war." Mara didn't have an answer for that. She only knew that 6 days ago, she'd been the person nobody in that room expected to matter, the understudy, the aide, the one filling water glasses while someone else did the important work. And somewhere between an empty chair and a light that touched 2 worlds at once, she'd learned that the important work had never required a title at all. It had only ever required someone willing to sit down and listen and believe that the space between 2 frightened people was worth trying to close.